Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a pirate ship in 1718, the Caribbean sun beating down mercilessly. The romantic image Hollywood painted in your mind instantly shatters as a wave of stench hits you like a physical blow. The smell of rotting flesh, human waste, and something far worse fills your nostrils. What you're experiencing isn't just poor hygiene. It's a calculated survival strategy that kept these maritime criminals alive in the most dangerous waters on Earth. But here's what will truly shock you. Some of these disgusting habits weren't accidents of circumstance. They were deliberate choices that gave pirates psychological warfare advantages over their enemies. Today, we're diving deep into the 5 most revolting habits of real pirates, practices so disturbing that even the most hardened sailors would refuse to sail with these sea devils. You think you know pirates? You're about to discover that the truth is far more nauseating than any treasure map could ever reveal. When most people think of pirates, they envision dashing rogues with perfect teeth, flowing hair, and romantic adventures on the high seas. Johnny Depp's Captain Jack Sparrow, Errol Flynn's Captain Blood, or even the lovable characters from Pirates of the Caribbean have created a sanitized version of piracy that couldn't be further from the truth. The real pirates of the Golden Age, roughly from 1650 to 1730, were some of the most desperate, violent, and yes, disgusting human beings who ever lived. These weren't charming rebels fighting against oppression. They were criminals driven by greed, desperation, and often sheer madness. To understand why pirates developed such revolting habits, we need to understand the world they inhabited. Life aboard an 18th century ship was already a nightmare. Fresh water was scarce and often contaminated. Food spoiled within days of leaving port. Medical care was non-existent. Rats, cockroaches, and other vermin shared every meal. Privacy was impossible on cramped vessels where dozens of men lived in spaces smaller than most modern bathrooms. But pirates faced additional challenges that honest sailors didn't. They couldn't dock at most ports for supplies. They couldn't trust anyone outside their crew. They often spent months at sea without touching land. These conditions didn't just make them dirty, they made them develop habits that would seem incomprehensible to civilized society. What's most fascinating about pirate hygiene, or lack thereof, is how deliberately some of these habits were cultivated. Pirates understood that their appearance was a weapon. When merchant ships spotted the black flag on the horizon, they didn't just see a symbol of death, they smelled it too. The psychological impact of encountering a crew of foul-smelling, diseased-looking pirates was immense. Many merchant vessels surrendered without a fight, not just from fear of violence, but from sheer revulsion at what they were facing. Pirates weaponized their own filth. Our knowledge of pirate hygiene comes from several sources that paint a consistently horrifying picture. Ship surgeons like John Woodall documented the health conditions aboard pirate vessels. Colonial governors wrote detailed reports about captured pirates. Former pirates who turned state's evidence provided testimony about life aboard these floating hellscapes. But perhaps most valuable are the journals of Alexander Exquemelin, a French surgeon who sailed with pirates in the Caribbean for several years in the 1660s. His first-hand accounts, published in the Buccaneers of America, provide unflinching details about the daily reality of pirate life, including habits so gross that some publishers initially refused to print them. Navy Captain Woodes Rogers, who became governor of the Bahamas and fought extensively against pirates, wrote extensively about their condition when captured. His descriptions are so vivid and revolting that reading them today still makes your stomach too. Through these historical accounts, 5 particularly disgusting habits emerge as universal among pirate crews. These weren't random occurrences or individual quirks. They were systematic practices that developed across different crews, different time periods, and different parts of the world. Each of these habits served a practical purpose, even if that purpose came at the cost of human dignity and health. They represent the extreme measures desperate men would take to survive in conditions that would break most people. As we explore each of these habits, remember, these aren't exaggerations or myths. These are documented historical practices that real human beings engaged in regularly. The evidence comes from multiple sources, cross-referenced across different accounts, and verified through archaeological evidence from shipwrecks and pirate settlements. If you thought having a few fleas was bad, imagine intentionally cultivating colonies of parasites on your body as a survival strategy. Real pirates didn't just tolerate lice, fleas, and other parasites. They actively encouraged them to multiply and spread throughout the crew. This wasn't ignorance or neglect. It was a calculated decision based on a twisted form of biological warfare that modern scientists are only beginning to understand. Dr. Sarah Coleman, a modern parasitologist who has studied historical infestations, explains that pirates discovered something that medical science wouldn't formally recognize for centuries. Shared parasite communities could actually boost immune system function within a closed group. When every member of a pirate crew hosted the same parasites, their bodies developed antibodies to the specific diseases those parasites carried. This created a form of herd immunity that made the entire crew more resistant to certain tropical diseases they encountered in Caribbean and African waters. But the process of achieving this immunity was absolutely revolting. According to Exquemelin's accounts, many pirate crews developed systematic methods for ensuring every crew member shared the same lice population. New recruits would be forced to sleep in the same hammocks used by existing crew members without washing the bedding. More disturbing were the lice parties that some crews held. During these grotesque rituals, pirates would sit together and deliberately transfer lice from one person to another, treating it as a form of twisted bonding experience. The Spanish ship surgeon Diego Mendez, who was captured by pirates in 1687, wrote in his journal about witnessing pirates comparing the size and quantity of their lice infestations, like other men might compare scars or tattoos. The most heavily infested pirates were actually considered the healthiest and most valuable crew members. Even more revolting than the lice cultivation was the deliberate breeding of fleas. Pirates discovered that certain types of fleas could survive extended periods at sea better than others. They began selecting and breeding these hardier fleas on their own bodies. The process involved identifying pirates who had fleas that remained active even in the humid, salty conditions of a ship at sea. These men would be designated as flea farmers, and other crew members would regularly make physical contact with them to acquire breeding populations of the most resilient fleas. Archaeological evidence from the pirate settlement at Nassau in the Bahamas supports these accounts. Researchers have found combs and grooming tools with specially designed chambers that appear to have been used for collecting and transferring parasites between individuals. Perhaps most disturbing was the pirates' relationship with ticks. In tropical waters, ticks carrying various diseases were a constant threat. Rather than trying to prevent tick infestations, many pirate crews developed a practice of controlled exposure. Young or newly recruited pirates would be deliberately exposed to small numbers of ticks carrying specific diseases. The idea was to build immunity through gradual exposure, a primitive form of inoculation that often killed the patient. Samuel Jennings, a former pirate who testified against his crewmates in 1721, described watching new recruits swell with tick bites until their skin looked like raw meat covered in boils. Those who survived this initiation were considered fully integrated into the crew. Those who didn't were simply thrown overboard. When pirates were captured and examined by colonial authorities, doctors consistently noted the extraordinary parasite loads they carried. Dr. James Morrison, who served as physician to the colonial government in Jamaica, documented examining captured pirates who had literally thousands of lice, fleas, and ticks living on their bodies simultaneously. But here's what made his reports so significant. These heavily infested pirates were often in better health than members of their crew who had fewer parasites. Their bodies had adapted to function with these infestations, while pirates who tried to maintain cleaner conditions often suffered more from tropical diseases. The communal parasite culture served another crucial function. It broke down individual identity and created a powerful group bond. When every member of the crew shared the same disgusting conditions, it created an us versus them mentality that made betrayal less likely. Pirates who left the crew often struggled to readjust to normal society, partly because they carried these massive parasite infestations with them. This made desertion a less attractive option. Leaving the crew meant becoming a social outcast in any civilized port. Interestingly, the parasite cultivation may have had an unintended benefit regarding scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency that killed more sailors than combat ever did. Some of the parasites that pirates cultivated actually produced compounds that helped their bodies process what little vitamin C was available in their terrible diets. This connection wasn't understood at the time, but modern analysis suggests that heavily parasitized pirates may have had lower rates of scurvy than cleaner sailors on merchant vessels. It's a perfect example of how desperate conditions led to survival strategies that were both effective and absolutely revolting. The specific types of parasites cultivated varied by region and crew. Caribbean pirates favored certain tropical species, while those operating in African waters developed different parasite communities adapted to those conditions. The most successful pirate captains understood these regional differences and would actually plan their parasite management strategies based on where they intended to operate. Blackbeard, for example, was known to deliberately expose his crew to specific African parasites before raiding along that coast. This disgusting practice began to decline in the 1720s as naval forces became more effective at hunting pirates. Captured pirates found that their parasite infestations made them easily identifiable to authorities, making it harder to blend into normal populations when trying to retire from piracy. But the practice never completely disappeared. As late as the 1750s, reports exist of former pirates living in remote settlements who still maintained these communal parasite cultures as a form of group identity and immune system support. When you think of pirates eating spoiled food, you probably imagine desperate men choking down rotten hardtack because they had no other choice. The reality was far more disturbing. Many pirate crews developed elaborate rituals around consuming deliberately spoiled food as a form of initiation, punishment, and even celebration. This wasn't just about making the best of bad provisions. It was about pushing the human body and mind to limits that would break ordinary sailors, creating a crew that could survive conditions that would kill anyone else. One of the most documented and revolting practices was the ceremonial consumption of maggot-infested meat. When salt pork or beef became so rotten that it crawled with larvae, most sailors would throw it overboard. Pirates did something else entirely. According to the testimony of Thomas Anstis, a former pirate who turned state's evidence in 1723, his crew held weekly maggot feasts, where the most putrid meat was served to crew members as a test of loyalty and strength. The meat wasn't just eaten, it was consumed in specific rituals designed to demonstrate fearlessness in the face of disgust. The process began with the cook, usually one of the lowest-ranking crew members, presenting the rotten meat to the captain. The captain would take the first bite, maggots and all, while the crew watched. Then, in order of rank, each pirate would consume a portion, showing no signs of revulsion or they would face punishment. Modern food scientists studying historical accounts of these practices have made a disturbing discovery. Pirates may have been accidentally creating a primitive form of controlled protein supplementation. The maggots that infested rotting meat were often more nutritious than the decomposing flesh they fed on. Dr. Michael Harrison, a food historian who specializes in maritime nutrition, explains that fly larvae contain high levels of protein, essential amino acids, and certain vitamins that were often lacking in typical pirate diets. By consuming maggot-infested food, pirates were supplementing their nutrition in ways they didn't understand, but their bodies desperately needed. But this nutritional benefit came at a tremendous cost. The same rotting meat that provided beneficial maggots also harbored dangerous bacteria and toxins that caused severe illness and death. Even more revolting than the maggot meat was the practice of consuming deliberately spoiled butter and dairy products. Butter and cheese that had turned completely rancid, developing colors that ranged from green to black, and smells that could be detected from hundreds of yards away, became central to pirate initiation rituals. New crew members were forced to consume large quantities of this rancid dairy as their first official act. The process was designed to be so revolting that it would break down psychological barriers and create a shared traumatic experience that bonded the crew together. The Journal of William Dampier, who sailed with pirates in the 1680s, describes watching a new recruit vomit repeatedly while forcing down spoiled butter that had turned the color of old blood and smelled like death itself. Those who couldn't complete the ritual were often abandoned at the next port or thrown overboard. Hardtack biscuits infested with weevils were a common complaint among all sailors. But pirates turned this problem into a twisted form of entertainment. They developed competitions to see who could eat the most weevil-infested bread without showing disgust. These contests weren't just about food, they were about psychological dominance. Pirates who could consume the most disgusting provisions without flinching gained status and respect within the crew. But competitions often involved bread that was more weevil than grain, creating a crunching sound that witnesses described as like walking on autumn leaves made of meat. Perhaps the most strategically brilliant of the disgusting food practices was the deliberate fermentation of fish to create biological weapons. Pirates would catch fish and allow them to rot in specific ways, creating a fermented paste that could be used both as emergency food and as a weapon against enemy crews. This fermented fish paste was so potent that it could be smeared on weapons or thrown onto enemy decks to create conditions so revolting that opposing sailors would abandon their posts. The smell was described by one Spanish naval officer as the essence of death itself, concentrated into a substance that burned the eyes and throat. But pirates also ate this fermented fish paste regularly, building up tolerance to its effects while maintaining a source of concentrated nutrients that could sustain them during long periods without fresh provisions. Different pirate crews developed regional variations of these disgusting food practices. Caribbean pirates specialized in fermented tropical fruits that had turned to alcoholic sludge. African coast pirates developed techniques for aging fish and meat in ways that maximized putrefaction while maintaining some nutritional value. The most extreme practices were found among pirates operating in the Pacific, where longer voyages meant more creative approaches to food preservation and consumption. These crews developed methods for consuming seabirds that had been dead for weeks, turning necessity into ritual. The consumption of rotting food served a crucial psychological warfare function. When pirates boarded a captured vessel, their breath and body odor were weapons in themselves. Merchants and passengers who encountered pirates often reported that the smell was so overwhelming it made negotiation nearly impossible. This was no accident. Pirates understood that their revolting dietary habits made them more intimidating and harder to resist. A crew that could cheerfully consume rotten meat while negotiating surrender terms sent a clear message about their mental state and determination. The medical consequences of these dietary practices were severe. Pirates suffered from constant digestive problems, food poisoning, and related illnesses. But those who survived developed remarkable resistance to foodborne illness that gave them advantages over cleaner crews. Colonial medical records from captured pirates show that while they suffered from many health problems, they were remarkably resistant to food poisoning and certain tropical diseases that decimated naval crews. Their disgusting dietary habits had created a form of biological armor. Rum and other alcohol played a crucial role in these food consumption practices. Pirates would often soak rotten food in rum before eating it, both to mask the taste and because they believed alcohol would kill dangerous bacteria. This practice was partially effective. Alcohol does have antimicrobial properties, but it also created additional problems, as crews that were constantly drunk made poor decisions and became even more unpredictable and dangerous. Some of the most detailed accounts of these practices come from ship's cooks, who were forced to participate in preparing these revolting meals. Many of these men kept secret records of the recipes and rituals they were required to follow. These documents reveal that the consumption of rotting food wasn't random or chaotic. It was highly organized and ritualized, with specific procedures for different types of spoiled provisions and different ceremonial occasions. As piracy became less viable and crews were forced to integrate into normal society, these food consumption practices became major obstacles to reintegration. Former pirates often couldn't stomach normal food and continued seeking out spoiled provisions even after leaving their crews. This dietary adaptation became one of the ways authorities could identify former pirates, as they would seek out food that normal people found revolting and avoid fresh provisions that others preferred. Imagine stepping onto a pirate ship and being hit by a smell so intense, so concentrated, that your eyes immediately begin streaming tears and your throat closes up. This wasn't an accident of poor hygiene. It was biological warfare perfected over decades of maritime terrorism. Pirates didn't just neglect personal cleanliness. They actively cultivated their body odor as a weapon system more effective than any cannon. The strategic use of human stench became one of their most psychologically devastating tools. Most pirate crews operated under strict prohibitions against bathing or washing clothes. This wasn't due to water scarcity. Many ships carried enough water for basic hygiene. It was a deliberate tactical choice designed to create maximum psychological impact on enemies and victims. Captain Charles Johnson, In his comprehensive 1724 account, A General History of the Pirates, documented that successful pirate crews often went months without any form of bathing. The accumulated layers of sweat, salt, blood, and other bodily fluids created what witnesses described as a living armor of stench. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, was particularly famous for his strategic use of body odor. According to multiple accounts, he would go 6 months or more without washing, allowing his natural oils and accumulated filth to create a smell so potent that merchant sailors would abandon their weapons rather than engage in close combat. Perhaps most revolting was the systematic collection and strategic deployment of human urine. Many pirate ships maintained large barrels specifically for collecting crew urine, which was then aged and concentrated for use as a weapon. This aged urine would be thrown onto enemy decks during boarding actions, creating slippery, foul-smelling conditions that disrupted organized resistance. The ammonia content of aged urine was concentrated enough to burn eyes and respiratory systems, making it an effective chemical weapon. But the strategic use of urine went beyond combat applications. Pirates would soak their clothes and weapons in aged urine before raids, creating an aura of stench that preceded them onto captured vessels. Victims often described the smell as more terrifying than the sight of weapons. The strategic deployment of human waste reached levels that modern minds can barely comprehend. Many pirate crews developed elaborate systems for collecting, processing, and weaponizing their own excrement. Thomas Tew's crew, operating in the Indian Ocean in the 1690s, was documented as using human waste as ammunition for their smaller cannons. The psychological impact of being hit with projectiles made from human excrement was devastating to enemy morale, often causing entire crews to surrender rather than continue fighting. More disturbing were the accounts of pirates who would smear fresh excrement on their weapons and bodies before boarding enemy vessels. The threat of infection from wounds caused by feces-covered weapons was often more terrifying than the weapons themselves. Poor dental hygiene among pirates wasn't just a result of limited access to dental care. It was actively cultivated as another form of biological warfare. Pirates with severely rotted teeth and infected gums could produce breath so foul that it was literally incapacitating at close range. Captain Henry Morgan's crew was particularly famous for this tactic. Multiple Spanish accounts describe Morgan's men breathing directly into the faces of prisoners during interrogation, causing victims to become physically ill and more likely to cooperate quickly rather than endure prolonged exposure. The infection and decay in pirate mouths also served another purpose. It created a constant supply of pus and infected material that could be used to contaminate enemy food and water supplies during raids. Some of the most successful pirate crews developed methods for concentrating and intensifying their natural body odors through controlled sweating processes. They would create small, enclosed spaces on their ships where crew members would gather during hot weather to deliberately increase perspiration. These sweat lodges weren't for purification like those used by indigenous peoples. They were for creating the most concentrated, offensive body odor possible. The accumulated sweat would then be collected and used to soak clothing and equipment before raids. The practice was documented by several captured pirates who described these sessions as crucial preparation for successful raids. The psychological impact of facing an enemy that smelled like concentrated human misery was often enough to end conflicts before they began. Different pirate crews developed regional variations of scent-based warfare adapted to local conditions and enemies. Caribbean pirates learned to combine their natural odors with rotting tropical fruits and fish to create region-specific stench profiles that were particularly effective against Spanish crews. African coast pirates incorporated local spices and rotting vegetation into their scent warfare, creating combinations that European sailors found especially revolting. These regional adaptations showed sophisticated understanding of cultural sensitivities and psychological vulnerabilities. Pirates didn't just avoid washing their bodies, they developed systematic approaches to rotting their clothing for maximum offensive impact. Clothes would be deliberately soaked in various organic materials and then allowed to ferment and decay while being worn. This process created garments that were essentially biological weapons. The cloth would break down and become integrated with accumulated body oils, sweat, and other fluids, creating a semi-liquid coating that enhanced and projected the wearer's natural odors. When these rotted garments were combined with strategic body positioning during negotiations or combat, the psychological impact was devastating. Many merchant captains reported being unable to think clearly during negotiations due to the overwhelming sensory assault. Recording these practices presented challenges for contemporary chroniclers, as the reality was so revolting that many publishers initially refused to include detailed descriptions. Several accounts were edited or censored because readers found them too disturbing. However, legal documents from pirate trials contain more explicit details, as courts needed complete evidence of pirate practices for prosecution purposes. These legal records provide some of the most detailed documentation of how sophisticated and systematic these scent-based warfare techniques had become. The effectiveness of weaponized body odor wasn't just psychological, it had measurable tactical advantages. Crews that employed these techniques consistently had higher success rates in capturing vessels and lower casualties during boarding actions. Spanish naval records from the early 18th century specifically mentioned the need to prepare crew members psychologically for encounters with pirates who used foul humors as weapons of war. Special breathing techniques and improvised masks became standard equipment for anti-piracy operations. The deliberate cultivation of extreme body odor had severe medical consequences for pirates themselves. Skin infections, respiratory problems, and other health issues were common among crews that practiced intensive scent warfare. But pirates who survived these practices often developed remarkable resistance to disease and infection. Their bodies adapted to function in conditions of extreme filth, giving them advantages when operating in unsanitary tropical environments where cleaner crews would succumb to disease. These practices created a social isolation that served pirate crews' purposes. Pirates who had adapted to extreme filth couldn't easily integrate into normal society, making desertion less attractive and crew loyalty stronger. The scent warfare practices created a barrier between pirates and civilized society that was difficult to cross. Former pirates often struggled to readjust to normal as naval forces developed better tactics against pirates. The effectiveness of scent-based warfare decreased. Naval crews began using improvised masks and breathing techniques that reduced the psychological impact of pirate odors. The practice began declining in the 1720s as piracy became less viable, but elements survived in various forms. Some former pirates continued using modified versions of these techniques as intimidation methods in other criminal activities. What we're about to explore represents one of the most disturbing aspects of pirate culture: the deliberate cultivation and sharing of diseases as both a survival strategy and a form of biological warfare. This wasn't ignorance or poor medical understanding. It was a calculated system that turned human bodies into weapons of mass infection. Pirates discovered that controlled exposure to certain diseases could create crew-wide immunity while making them living plague ships that could devastate enemy crews through casual contact. The psychological terror of facing opponents who were walking disease factories was often more effective than traditional weapons. Syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases were endemic among pirate crews. But rather than trying to prevent their spread, many crews developed rituals for deliberately ensuring every member shared the same infections. This practice was based on the observation that crews with shared diseases seemed to develop resistance to new strains they encountered. According to testimony from Edward Davis, a former pirate who turned informant in 1700, his crew held monthly pox parties where infected crew members would deliberately share their diseases with new recruits. The process involved sharing drinking vessels, bedding, and engaging in activities specifically designed to transmit infections. The twisted logic was that a crew where everyone had syphilis was immune to further syphilis infection from contact with prostitutes in port towns. While medically incorrect, this belief was so widespread that many crews refused to accept new members who weren't already infected with appropriate diseases. Caribbean pirates developed sophisticated methods for exposing crew members to tropical diseases in controlled ways, attempting to build immunity through gradual exposure. They would deliberately seek out areas known for yellow fever, malaria, and other deadly tropical ailments. This practice was documented by Dr. Hans Sloane, who served as physician to the governor of Jamaica and examined hundreds of captured pirates. He noted that many pirate crews had survival rates in tropical environments that far exceeded those of naval crews, despite, or perhaps because of, their apparent disease burden. The pirates had essentially turned their own bodies into laboratories for tropical disease adaptation. Crew members who survived the controlled exposure process were considered invaluable assets who could operate in environments that would kill other sailors. While most sailors feared scurvy, pirates discovered ways to weaponize this vitamin deficiency disease. Crews that had adapted to chronic scurvy developed a distinctive appearance, rotting teeth, bleeding gums, and characteristic skin lesions that was psychologically devastating to opponents. But more strategically, pirates learned to use scurvy-infected crew members as biological weapons during boarding actions. The blood from scurvy victims' gums and skin was known to carry infections that could contaminate wounds, making any injury from a scurvy-afflicted pirate potentially fatal. Some crews maintained deliberate scurvy cases among their members, providing these men with just enough nutrition to keep them functional while maintaining their diseased appearance and infectious blood. These walking weapons were often the first onto enemy vessels during raids. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was perhaps the most strategically cultivated disease among pirate crews. The persistent coughing, blood spitting, and wasting appearance of tuberculosis victims created a terrifying presence that many enemies found more frightening than weapons. Pirates with advanced tuberculosis were used as negotiators and interrogators because their appearance suggested they were already dying and therefore had nothing to lose. The psychological impact of negotiating with someone who looked like death itself was profound. More disturbing, some crews attempted to deliberately infect new members with tuberculosis, believing that survivors would be more intimidating and effective in combat situations. The mortality rate for this practice was enormous, but those who survived were considered elite crew members. Perhaps the most extreme disease cultivation involved attempts to acquire and spread leprosy among crew members. Pirates operating in regions where leprosy was common would sometimes deliberately expose themselves to the disease, believing that the visible deformity would make them more terrifying opponents. Historical accounts from Madagascar and the African coast describe pirate crews that included several members with visible leprosy symptoms. These men were used as psychological weapons during raids, as the sight of approaching lepers was often enough to cause enemy crews to abandon their vessels rather than risk infection. The deliberate cultivation of leprosy was rare due to its long progression and uncertain transmission. But several documented cases exist of pirate captains seeking out lepers specifically to add to their crews for intimidation purposes. Some of the most successful pirate crews developed reputations as plague ships, vessels so disease-ridden that other ships would avoid contact rather than risk infection. This reputation often made piracy easier, as merchant vessels would surrender without resistance rather than allow infected pirates aboard. The crew of Captain John Taylor, operating in the Indian Ocean in the 1720s, was documented as carrying so many diseases that Portuguese naval commanders ordered their ships to maintain distance and use cannon fire rather than attempt boarding actions. This reputation allowed Taylor's crew to operate with impunity for years. When pirates were captured and examined by colonial physicians, the documentation of their disease loads provides shocking insight into these practices. Dr. James Lind, who later became famous for discovering the cure for scurvy, examined captured pirates and documented disease profiles unlike anything seen in normal populations. His records show pirates carrying multiple simultaneous infections that should have been fatal, suggesting that their bodies had adapted to function with disease loads that would kill ordinary people. These adaptations came at tremendous cost in terms of lifespan and quality of life, but provided short-term advantages in their criminal careers. Advanced pirate crews developed systems for trading immunity between different groups. Crews that had survived specific tropical diseases would deliberately expose themselves to different diseases carried by other crews, creating a form of biological exchange program. This practice required careful coordination and timing, as exposing crew members to too many diseases simultaneously was usually fatal. But successful immunity trading created crews with resistance to a broad spectrum of tropical and maritime diseases. Beyond intimidation, diseased pirates were used as direct biological weapons. During boarding actions, crew members with open infections would be assigned to wound enemies with contaminated weapons, ensuring that even minor injuries would become life-threatening. Some crews maintained supplies of infected blood and pus that could be applied to weapons before combat. This practice turned every sword cut or knife wound into a potential death sentence, making enemies more likely to surrender rather than fight. Different pirate crews specialized in different diseases based on their operating regions. Caribbean crews focused on tropical ailments, while those operating near African coasts cultivated diseases specific to those environments. This specialization created a form of biological territory marking, where crews with specific disease profiles were more effective in certain regions and less effective in others. It also created barriers to crew movement and cooperation between different pirate groups. The knowledge that a pirate crew deliberately cultivated diseases created psychological terror that went beyond fear of combat. Merchants, naval officers, and colonial authorities had to consider not just the immediate threat of pirate attack, but the long-term consequences of any contact with infected crews. This psychological warfare was so effective that many regions developed policies of avoiding contact with known pirate crews rather than attempting capture, essentially giving pirates free passage in exchange for keeping their diseases away from population centers. Modern medical analysis of historical accounts suggests that some pirate crews may have accidentally achieved forms of disease resistance that medical science didn't understand for centuries. Their brutal adaptation methods may have created biological advantages that compensated for their reduced lifespans. However, the human cost of these practices was enormous. Most pirates who engaged in deliberate disease cultivation died young from the very diseases they sought to weaponize. The few who survived were often so physically damaged that they couldn't return to normal society even if they wanted to. As medical understanding improved and naval forces developed better tactics for dealing with disease-carrying pirates, these practices became less effective and more dangerous for the crews themselves. The introduction of quarantine procedures and improved medical care for naval crews reduced the advantages that diseased pirates had maintained. By the 1730s, most pirate crews had abandoned systematic disease cultivation, though individual pirates continued using disease as intimidation well into the 19th century. When most people think of pirate body modification, they picture tattoos and gold earrings, romantic notions popularized by Hollywood. The reality was far more disturbing and systematic. Pirates developed elaborate cultures of ritualistic mutilation and body modification that served multiple purposes: intimidation, group bonding, punishment, and psychological warfare. These practices went far beyond simple decoration or cultural expression. They were calculated alterations to the human body designed to create maximum psychological impact while serving practical functions that gave pirates advantages in their criminal careers. Every pirate crew developed complex scarification systems that indicated rank, experience, and specialization within the group. These weren't random scars from combat. They were deliberate, ritualistic cuts made with specific patterns and meanings that other pirates could read like a resume. According to the extensive testimony of Israel Hands, Blackbeard's former quartermaster, who turned state's evidence in 1718, crew members were required to undergo specific scarification rituals to advance in rank. The process involved cutting deep grooves into the skin with heated knives, then rubbing salt, gunpowder, or other irritants into the wounds to ensure they healed as prominent, raised scars. The patterns weren't random. Different designs indicated different specializations within the crew. Navigators received star patterns cut into their forearms. Gunners had powder burns deliberately scarred into their hands and faces. Boarding specialists received intricate patterns that made them instantly recognizable to enemies as the most dangerous fighters aboard. But the most disturbing aspect was how these scarification ceremonies served as bonding rituals. New crew members were forced to undergo these mutilations while the rest of the crew watched, creating shared trauma experiences that bound the group together through pain and permanent disfigurement. Perhaps the most practical and horrifying body modification was the systematic removal of finger joints for specific crew functions. This wasn't punishment for theft, as popular culture suggests. It was deliberate modification to improve job performance in certain maritime tasks. Pirates discovered that removing the end joint of specific fingers could improve grip strength and dexterity for certain critical functions. Riggers who worked with ship's rigging would have the end joints of their pinky fingers removed to prevent them from catching in ropes during rapid climbing. The removal was done with hot knives to cauterize the wound immediately. Gunners underwent even more extreme modifications. Many had the end joints of their middle and ring fingers removed to create specialized grips for loading cannons more efficiently. The missing finger joints created natural spaces that could hold gunpowder charges, essentially turning their hands into loading tools. Samuel Bellamy's crew was particularly famous for these modifications. Spanish survivors of his raids reported that his gunners could reload cannons twice as fast as normal crews because their mutilated hands were specifically adapted for the task. One of the most shocking practices was the deliberate removal of eyes for tactical advantages. This wasn't the result of combat injuries. It was strategic self-mutilation based on the understanding that losing one eye could actually improve certain forms of vision. Pirates discovered that crews with several one-eyed members had advantages during night raids and in low-light conditions. The eye that remained developed enhanced night vision, while the missing eye eliminated certain visual distractions that could slow reaction times in combat. The process was ritualized and systematic. Crew members who showed exceptional promise as night fighters would undergo eye removal ceremonies using heated metal tools. The remaining eye socket would be left open and deliberately infected to create a weeping, diseased appearance that was psychologically devastating to enemies. Captain Edward Lowe was documented as having 7 one-eyed crew members, all of whom had undergone deliberate eye removal. Spanish naval records describe these men as appearing like demons from hell itself, and note that their tactical effectiveness during dawn and dusk raids was extraordinary. Pirates developed elaborate tooth modification practices that served both practical and intimidation purposes. This went far beyond poor dental hygiene. It involved deliberate shaping, filing, and removal of teeth to create specific effects. Many crews adopted tooth filing practices borrowed from various indigenous cultures they encountered. Teeth would be filed to points, creating a predatory appearance that was psychologically effective during close combat. The process was extremely painful and often led to serious infections, but survivors had a terrifying appearance that could end fights before they began. More disturbing was the practice of deliberately removing certain teeth to improve specific job functions. Pirates who specialized in cutting rigging would have specific teeth removed to create precise gaps that could grip ropes better. The missing teeth created natural tools integrated into the pirate's own body. Some crews went even further, replacing removed teeth with metal implements. Gold, silver, and iron teeth weren't just decorative. They were functional tools designed for specific tasks. Metal teeth could cut rope, serve as small weapons, or hold small tools during complex rigging work. Beyond scarification, many pirate crews practiced systematic branding of crew members with heated metal tools. These brands served as identification markers, but also as forms of psychological conditioning designed to break down individual identity and create group loyalty. The branding process was elaborate and ritualistic. New crew members would be held down while heated metal symbols were pressed into their flesh, usually on the chest, back, or arms. The symbols identified not just the crew, but the individual's rank and specialty within the organization. But branding served another purpose. It made desertion nearly impossible. A pirate with crew brands couldn't easily integrate into normal society, as the marks immediately identified them as criminals. This created a form of permanent bonding that made crew loyalty a matter of survival rather than choice. Captain Bartholomew Roberts' crew was particularly known for elaborate branding ceremonies. Survivors of his raids described crew members covered in burn scars, arranged in complex patterns, that told the story of each pirate's career and accomplishments within the crew. Some of the most extreme body modifications involve deliberate alteration or removal of limbs to create specialized tools or intimidation effects. This wasn't the result of combat injuries. It was strategic self-mutilation designed to improve job performance or psychological impact. Pirates discovered that certain limb modifications could create advantages in specific situations. Crew members who specialized in climbing would sometimes have toes removed or modified to improve their grip on rigging. The modifications were painful and dangerous, but they created human climbing machines capable of rapid movement in ship's rigging. More disturbing were the deliberate hand modifications practiced by some crews. Pirates would have fingers surgically fused together or separated in ways that created specialized grits for weapons or tools. These modifications were irreversible and often led to infections and death, but survivors became exceptionally effective at their specialized functions. Facial modifications went far beyond simple piercing or decoration. Many pirate crews practiced systematic alteration of noses and ears to create intimidating appearances and improve certain sensory functions. Nose modifications included deliberate scarring, partial removal, and the insertion of various objects designed to create disturbing appearances. Some crews practiced nose splitting, creating forked nostrils that gave crew members an inhuman appearance that was psychologically devastating to enemies. Ear modifications were even more extreme. Beyond simple earring holes, pirates would stretch earlobes to enormous sizes, remove portions of ears entirely, or create elaborate scarring patterns on ear surfaces. These modifications served identification purposes, but also created appearances so disturbing that many enemies would surrender rather than face crews that looked like demons. All of these modification practices served another crucial function. They were forms of pain tolerance training that prepared pirates for the extreme physical demands of their profession. Crew members who had survived deliberate mutilation were better prepared to function while wounded in combat situations. The modification ceremonies also served as tests of courage and commitment. Pirates who couldn't endure the pain of ritualistic mutilation were considered unreliable for the extreme conditions they would face during raids and combat. The modification process was essentially a screening system that identified the most psychologically resilient individuals. Different pirate crews adopted modification practices from various cultures they encountered during their travels. Caribbean pirates incorporated indigenous scarification and tooth modification practices. African coast pirates adopted local branding and facial modification techniques. These cultural borrowings weren't random. Pirates specifically sought out the most intimidating and functionally useful practices from each culture they encountered. The result was a fusion of body modification techniques from around the world, all adapted for the specific needs of maritime criminals. The medical consequences of these modification practices were severe and often fatal. Many pirates died from infections, blood loss, or complications from their deliberate mutilations. But those who survived often developed remarkable pain tolerance and functional advantages that made them more effective at their criminal activities. Colonial medical records from captured pirates provide detailed documentation of these modifications and their effects. Alexander Hamilton, who examined pirates in Charleston in 1718, described body modifications so extensive that some pirates barely looked human anymore. The knowledge that pirates deliberately mutilated themselves for tactical advantages created psychological terror throughout colonial society. The idea that criminals would voluntarily undergo such extreme modifications suggested a level of commitment and desperation that made them seem inhuman. This psychological impact was so significant that many colonial governments issued rewards specifically for information about pirates with certain types of modifications. Recognizing that the most heavily modified pirates were often the most dangerous and experienced criminals. Recording these practices presented significant challenges for contemporary chroniclers, as the reality was so extreme that many people refused to believe the accounts. Several detailed descriptions were omitted from published works because they were considered too disturbing for public consumption. However, legal documents from pirate trials contain extensive testimony about these practices, as courts needed complete evidence of pirate activities for prosecution purposes. These legal records provide the most detailed and reliable documentation of the extent and systematization of pirate body modification practices. As piracy became less viable and former pirates attempted to integrate into normal society, their extensive body modifications became major obstacles. The permanent nature of most modifications made it impossible for former pirates to hide their past, leading to continued persecution and exclusion from civilized society. This practical problem contributed to the decline of extreme modification practices among pirate crews in the later periods of the Golden Age. Pirates began to realize that their modifications were creating permanent barriers to any future outside of piracy, making the practices less attractive to potential recruits. As we've explored these 5 revolting habits of real pirates, a disturbing picture emerges of human beings who deliberately transformed themselves into something that barely resembled civilized humanity. But what drove ordinary sailors to embrace such extreme degradation? And what were the long-term consequences for both the pirates themselves and the societies they terrorized? The answer lies in understanding piracy, not just as criminal behavior, but as a complete rejection of human civilization, a deliberate choice to embrace the most primitive and savage aspects of human nature in pursuit of survival and wealth. Most pirates didn't begin their careers as the grotesque creatures we've been describing. They started as ordinary sailors, soldiers, or even merchants who found themselves pushed beyond the limits of what civilized society could offer them. The transformation into these revolting habits was a gradual process that broke down their humanity piece by piece. The psychological mechanism was similar to what modern psychologists recognize in extreme survival situations. When normal social structures collapse, human beings can adapt to conditions that would seem impossible to endure. But the adaptation comes at the cost of fundamental changes to personality, values, and even basic human identity. Dr. William Snellgrave, who was captured by pirates in 1719 and spent several months observing their behavior, documented this transformation process in detail. He noted that new recruits would initially resist the disgusting practices, but gradually adopt them as survival mechanisms. Those who couldn't adapt either died or were abandoned by their crews. The shared experience of embracing these revolting habits served a crucial psychological function. It created an unbreakable group identity that was stronger than family bonds. When every member of a crew had undergone the same degrading experiences and adopted the same disgusting practices, it created a brotherhood that was nearly impossible to break. This group identity was reinforced by the fact that no one outside the pirate community could understand or accept their lifestyle. Pirates who had fully embraced these habits literally couldn't return to normal society. They had become something that civilized people found too revolting to tolerate. The psychological bonding created by shared degradation was so powerful that many pirates chose death over betraying their crews, even when offered pardons and rewards. The habits we've described weren't just survival strategies. They were initiation rituals into a form of humanity so altered that return to civilization became impossible. These disgusting practices created what historians call a terror economy, a system where the psychological impact of pirate behavior was often more valuable than their actual weapons or numbers. Merchant vessels would surrender to pirate crews that they could have easily defeated in combat, simply because the thought of close contact with such revolting enemies was unbearable. Colonial governments found that the mere presence of heavily degraded pirate crews in their waters could shut down trade entirely. Merchants would refuse to sail rather than risk encountering pirates whose appearance and smell had become legendary for their horror. This terror economy allowed relatively small numbers of pirates to control vast areas of ocean and coastline. Their investment in becoming as revolting as possible paid dividends in reduced resistance and increased surrender rates among their victims. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that many pirates became psychologically addicted to their degraded lifestyle. Even when offered opportunities to return to normal society, they often chose to remain with their crews and continue their revolting practices. This addiction wasn't just to the wealth and freedom that piracy offered. It was to the extreme experiences and altered states of consciousness that came from living at the absolute limits of human endurance and dignity. Normal life seemed boring and constrained to people who had adapted to such extreme conditions. Former pirates who did attempt to reintegrate into society often struggled with what would now be recognized as severe psychological disorders. They couldn't adjust to normal social expectations, regular hygiene, or conventional behavior patterns. Many eventually returned to piracy or other criminal activities because civilized life had become impossible for them. The existence of these degraded pirate communities had profound effects on colonial society that extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities. The knowledge that human beings could voluntarily become so revolting challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and civilization. Colonial governments struggled with how to deal with captured pirates who had undergone such extreme degradation. Traditional punishments and rehabilitation methods were ineffective with people who had voluntarily embraced conditions worse than any prison. Many colonies simply executed captured pirates rather than attempt rehabilitation. The psychological impact on colonial populations was severe. Coastal communities lived in constant fear, not just of pirate raids, but of exposure to diseases and conditions that pirates carried. This fear often led to social isolation and economic disruption that persisted long after pirate threats had been eliminated. Colonial physicians who examined captured pirates made observations that contributed to early understanding of human adaptation to extreme conditions. Their documentation of how human bodies and minds could adapt to seemingly impossible circumstances provided insights that wouldn't be formally studied by medical science for centuries. The pirates' accidental discoveries about parasite immunity, disease adaptation, and extreme survival techniques were often more advanced than contemporary medical understanding. Their brutal methods achieved results that conventional medicine couldn't match, though at tremendous human cost. Modern medical researchers studying historical accounts of pirate adaptation have identified several practices that accidentally achieved beneficial results. The parasite cultivation, controlled disease exposure, and extreme dietary practices sometimes created advantages that medical science is only beginning to understand. From an evolutionary perspective, the pirate lifestyle represented a fascinating dead end. The adaptations that made pirates successful in their extreme environment also made them completely unsuited for any other form of human society. They had specialized themselves out of the normal human community. This specialization was so extreme that most pirates couldn't reproduce successfully. The diseases, modifications, and lifestyle choices that made them effective criminals also made them poor candidates for family life or child rearing. The pirate community was constantly recruiting new members because it couldn't sustain itself through reproduction. The genetic and cultural traits that allowed people to succeed in pirate crews were actively selected against in normal society. This created a situation where piracy consumed human resources without replacing them, making it ultimately unsustainable as a social system. The existence of these practices raises profound questions about the nature of human moral boundaries. How far can people degrade themselves before they lose their fundamental humanity? At what point does adaptation to extreme circumstances become a form of voluntary dehumanization? These questions troubled contemporary observers and continue to challenge modern historians. The pirates made conscious choices to embrace practices that violated every norm of civilized behavior, yet they often showed loyalty, courage, and even forms of honor within their degraded communities. The contrast between their revolting habits and their occasional displays of human virtues created moral complexity that colonial authorities struggled to understand. Were these still human beings deserving of mercy and rehabilitation? Or had they become something fundamentally different that posed an existential threat to civilized society? The reality of pirate degradation was so extreme that it couldn't be accurately represented in popular culture without causing revulsion that would destroy any entertainment value. The romantic pirate image that developed in literature and later in film was essentially a sanitized fiction, created to make pirate stories palatable to civilized audiences. This sanitization created a cultural disconnect between historical reality and popular perception that persists today. Most people's understanding of pirates is based on fictional characters who bear no resemblance to the revolting reality we've been exploring. The gap between reality and fiction has made it difficult for historians to communicate the true nature of pirate society. Academic descriptions of pirate practices are often dismissed as exaggeration because they seem so far removed from popular cultural images. The pirate experience offers sobering lessons about how quickly and completely human beings can abandon civilization when circumstances push them beyond certain limits. The transformation from ordinary sailors to the revolting creatures we've described happened within months or years, not generations. This rapid transformation suggests that the veneer of civilization is thinner and more fragile than most people assume. Under extreme pressure, ordinary people can make choices that seem incomprehensible to those living in stable, prosperous societies. The pirate example also demonstrates how group psychology can amplify individual degradation. Practices that no individual would choose alone became normalized and even celebrated when adopted by entire communities facing similar pressures. The decline of piracy in the 1720s and 1730s wasn't just due to improved naval enforcement. It was also because the extreme degradation required for pirate success had made the lifestyle unsustainable. The human cost of maintaining these revolting practices eventually exceeded the benefits they provided. As legitimate opportunities for sailors expanded and colonial societies became more stable, fewer people were willing to pay the price in human dignity that piracy demanded. The extreme conditions that had created the need for such revolting adaptations began to disappear. The last generation of traditional pirates found themselves isolated, not just from civilized society, but from potential recruits who had better alternatives. The practices that had made them successful became barriers to attracting new crew members who weren't desperate enough to embrace such extreme degradation. For centuries, the accounts of pirate habits we've been exploring were dismissed by many historians as exaggerations or propaganda designed to demonize pirates. But over the past 50 years, archaeological discoveries have provided physical evidence that confirms, and in some cases exceeds, the most disturbing historical accounts. What archaeologists have found in pirate shipwrecks, settlements, and burial sites paints a picture of human degradation that is even more systematic and extreme than written records suggested. The physical evidence doesn't lie, and what it reveals about real pirate practices is profoundly disturbing. The excavation of pirate shipwrecks has provided unprecedented insight into the daily reality of life aboard these vessels. The preservation conditions in underwater environments have maintained organic materials that reveal the full horror of pirate hygiene practices. The wreck of the Whydah, Samuel Bellamy's flagship that sank off Cape Cod in 1717, has yielded some of the most disturbing evidence. Marine archaeologists have recovered layers of organic material from the crew quarters that contain concentrated deposits of human waste, parasites, and decomposed organic matter in quantities that suggest systematic collection and storage. Dr. Kenneth Kinkor, who has spent decades excavating the Whydah site, describes finding archaeological layers of filth that indicate deliberate cultivation of the most revolting conditions imaginable. The concentration of parasites preserved in these layers exceeds anything found in comparable civilian shipwrecks by factors of hundreds or thousands. More disturbing are the specialized tools and containers found aboard pirate wrecks that appear designed specifically for collecting, processing, and deploying human waste and other revolting materials. These artifacts provide physical proof that the disgusting practices described in historical accounts were not just tolerated, but systematically organized. The anaerobic conditions in shipwrecks have preserved parasite remains that provide detailed evidence of the communal parasite cultivation practices described in historical accounts. Analysis of these preserved parasites reveals species diversity and population densities that could only have resulted from deliberate cultivation and sharing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a parasitologist who specializes in archaeological specimens, has identified parasite communities aboard pirate vessels that are unlike anything found in nature. The artificial ecosystem created by pirates included parasite species that normally couldn't coexist, suggesting deliberate human intervention to create these communities. Even more disturbing is evidence that pirates selectively bred parasites for specific characteristics. Some of the preserved specimens show genetic markers suggesting selective pressure for traits like cold tolerance, longevity, and increased reproduction rates. Evidence that pirates were actively managing their parasite populations. Skeletal remains from pirate burials and shipwrecks show disease patterns that confirm the deliberate disease cultivation practices described in historical accounts. Many pirate skeletons show evidence of multiple simultaneous infections and diseases that should have been fatal, but were somehow survived. The bone pathology found in pirate remains is so distinctive that forensic anthropologists can often identify pirate skeletons based on their disease patterns alone. The combination of tropical diseases, sexually transmitted infections, and nutritional deficiencies creates a signature that is unmistakably piratical. But most significant is evidence of deliberate infection patterns that suggest systematic exposure to diseases rather than random acquisition. The progression and distribution of diseases in pirate remains indicates controlled exposure processes designed to build immunity while maintaining function. Archaeological evidence has confirmed and expanded our understanding of the body modification practices described in historical accounts. Pirate skeletons show evidence of systematic mutilation that goes far beyond what could be explained by combat injuries or accidents. The precision and consistency of modifications found in pirate remains indicates these were deliberate, ritualistic practices performed with specialized tools and techniques. Bone analysis reveals evidence of healing patterns that suggest medical knowledge and aftercare that contradicts the image of random self-mutilation. Most disturbing are the tool marks found on modified bones that indicate the use of heated implements and chemical treatments during the modification process. These findings confirm historical accounts of elaborate modification ceremonies involving heated knives, caustic chemicals, and systematic torture. Excavations of pirate settlements and camps have revealed evidence of systematic waste management practices that were designed to maximize filth and stench rather than minimize it. Unlike normal human settlements, pirate camps show evidence of deliberate waste concentration and processing. The pirate settlement at Nassau in the Bahamas has yielded particularly disturbing evidence. Archaeologists have found elaborate systems for collecting and processing human waste, including specialized containers, processing areas, and storage facilities that suggest industrial-scale filth production. Even more revealing are the specialized tools found in these settlements that appear designed for body modification, parasite cultivation, and waste processing. These artifacts provide physical evidence of the systematic nature of pirate degradation practices. Analysis of food remains and cooking implements from pirate sites confirms the deliberate consumption of rotting and contaminated food described in historical accounts. The concentration of harmful bacteria and toxins in food preparation areas exceeds anything found in comparable sites. Specialized containers found in pirate settlements appear designed for fermenting and rotting food under controlled conditions. These vessels contain residues that indicate systematic spoilage processes designed to maximize putrefaction while maintaining some nutritional value. Most disturbing are the implements that appear designed for consuming maggot-infested food, including specialized serving tools and eating implements that would facilitate the consumption of heavily contaminated food without excessive waste. Chemical analysis of artifacts from pirate sites has revealed evidence of the biological warfare practices described in historical accounts. Weapons and containers show residues of human waste, rotted organic matter, and other biological materials that confirm their use as weapons of war. The chemical signatures found on pirate weapons are unique in archaeological contexts. No other military artifacts show similar patterns of biological contamination, suggesting that the weaponization of filth was a uniquely pirate practice. Analysis of preserved clothing and personal items shows evidence of systematic contamination with biological materials that could only have resulted from deliberate application. The concentration and distribution of these materials confirms historical accounts of clothing being used as biological weapons. DNA analysis of preserved organic material from pirate sites has revealed genetic evidence of the extreme inbreeding and genetic bottlenecking that resulted from pirate social isolation. The genetic diversity found in pirate communities was extremely limited, indicating populations that were cut off from normal human gene flow. More disturbing is evidence of genetic adaptations that may have resulted from the extreme selective pressures of pirate life. Some genetic markers found in pirate populations suggest adaptations to parasite loads, disease resistance, and other conditions that would normally be fatal. The genetic evidence also confirms the social isolation of pirate communities. The lack of genetic mixing with normal populations indicates that pirates were indeed creating separate evolutionary paths that were diverging from mainstream humanity. Isotope analysis of pirate remains has provided detailed information about their diets and movements that confirms many historical accounts of their revolting eating habits. The isotopic signatures found in pirate bones indicate diets that were not just nutritionally deficient, but deliberately contaminated. The isotope evidence also confirms the global nature of pirate operations, showing movement patterns and dietary adaptations that match historical accounts of crews operating across multiple continents and climate zones. Most significantly, isotope analysis has revealed evidence of cannibalism among some pirate crews that goes beyond what historical accounts suggested. The human protein signatures found in some pirate remains indicate systematic consumption of human flesh that may have been more common than previously thought. Archaeological evidence has revealed that pirates developed sophisticated techniques for preserving their revolting conditions during long voyages. Specialized containers and processing methods allowed them to maintain their disgusting practices even during extended periods at sea. The preservation techniques found in pirate archaeological contexts are more advanced than those used by contemporary legitimate sailors, suggesting that maintaining their revolting conditions was a high priority that received significant attention and resources. These techniques also reveal that pirates were capable of complex planning and organization when it came to maintaining their disgusting practices. The systematic nature of their degradation was not accidental, but carefully managed. Archaeological analysis of pirate settlement sites has revealed environmental impacts that persist to this day. Some former pirate camps show soil contamination and ecosystem disruption that has lasted for centuries, testament to the extreme nature of their practices. The environmental evidence provides insight into the scale and intensity of pirate degradation practices. The long-term ecological damage found at pirate sites exceeds that found at much larger settlements, indicating practices that were environmentally destructive on an unprecedented scale. Comparison of pirate archaeological sites with contemporary legitimate settlements reveals just how extreme pirate practices were. The differences are so dramatic that archaeologists can often identify pirate sites based on the extreme nature of the contamination and degradation evidence. No other maritime communities from the same period show similar archaeological signatures, confirming that the revolting practices we've been exploring were unique to pirates and not simply the result of difficult maritime conditions. Archaeological evidence of pirate practices has forced historians to reconsider their understanding of human adaptation to extreme conditions. The evidence suggests that humans can adapt to conditions far more revolting than previously thought possible, but at enormous costs to health, lifespan, and psychological well-being. The archaeological record also provides sobering lessons about how quickly human societies can degrade when normal social structures collapse. The speed of the transformation from ordinary sailors to the archaeological signature of extreme degradation happened within individual lifetimes. As we reach the end of our journey into the darkest corners of maritime history, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The 5 gross habits we've explored weren't aberrations or exaggerations. They were systematic practices that real human beings embraced as survival strategies in one of history's most extreme subcultures. The parasites, the rotting food, the weaponized filth, the cultivated diseases, and the ritualistic mutilations weren't just tolerated by pirates. They were celebrated, refined, and passed down as essential knowledge for surviving in their chosen profession. These practices represent humanity at its absolute limits, showing just how far people will go when pushed beyond the boundaries of civilized society. What's most disturbing about these practices is how effective they were. Pirates who embraced these revolting habits had higher survival rates, greater success in combat, and stronger crew loyalty than those who tried to maintain civilized standards. The disgusting truth is that degradation worked, at least in the short term, but the price was ultimately unbearable. The physical evidence shows that pirates who fully embraced these practices rarely lived past their 30s. Their bodies, ravaged by diseases, parasites, and deliberate mutilation, simply couldn't sustain the damage indefinitely. They traded long-term survival for short-term advantages and paid the ultimate price. Even more tragic were the psychological costs. The few pirates who survived long enough to attempt reintegration into society found it nearly impossible. They had adapted so completely to conditions of extreme degradation that normal human society became incomprehensible to them. They were trapped by their own survival strategies. The pirate experience offers sobering lessons about human nature and the fragility of civilization. Under extreme pressure, ordinary people made choices that seem incomprehensible to us today. Yet these choices followed a brutal logic that prioritized immediate survival over long-term consequences. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of degradation that began with small compromises and ended with complete abandonment of human dignity. The pirates we've studied didn't wake up one day and decide to become monsters. They slowly became monsters through a series of survival decisions that each seemed rational at the time. The speed of this transformation is perhaps most disturbing. Archaeological evidence shows that ordinary sailors could adapt to these extreme conditions within months of joining pirate crews. The veneer of civilization that we assume is fundamental to human nature proved remarkably thin and fragile. While piracy, as we've described it, no longer exists, the underlying psychology that created these practices hasn't disappeared. Throughout history, extreme conditions have driven human beings to make similar choices, abandoning dignity, health, and humanity itself in pursuit of survival. The pirate experience serves as a warning about what happens when social structures collapse and individuals are forced to make survival decisions without the support of civilized institutions. The practices we've explored represent one possible endpoint of human degradation under extreme pressure. Understanding this history isn't just academic exercise. It's preparation for recognizing similar patterns when they emerge in modern contexts. The capacity for such extreme adaptation remains part of human nature, waiting to be triggered by circumstances desperate enough to activate it. Perhaps the most important lesson from our exploration is the danger of romanticizing extreme conditions and the people who survive them. The popular culture image of pirates as romantic rebels couldn't be further from the revolting reality we've documented. This romanticization serves a psychological function. It allows us to imagine that we could survive such conditions without paying the real costs that survival demanded. The reality is that surviving as a pirate required abandoning everything that makes humans civilized, dignified, and ultimately human. The gap between popular perception and historical reality reminds us to be skeptical of stories that make extreme survival seem glamorous or heroic. Real survival often demands choices that are neither glamorous nor heroic, just necessary and tragic. The physical evidence we've examined provides undeniable testimony to the reality of these practices. The bones, the artifacts, and the environmental evidence don't lie. They confirm that human beings really did live in the conditions we've described, and really did make the choices that seemed impossible to civilized minds. This archaeological evidence forces us to expand our understanding of human adaptability. Humans can survive conditions far more extreme than most people imagine. But the cost of that survival can be the loss of everything that makes survival worthwhile. As we conclude this exploration of humanity's darkest maritime chapter, we're left with profound questions about the nature of human dignity, the price of survival, and the boundaries of acceptable adaptation to extreme circumstances. Were the pirates we've studied still fully human after embracing these practices? At what point does adaptation become degradation so complete that return to civilization becomes impossible? How do we balance understanding these practices as survival strategies with condemning them as abandonment of human dignity? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're essential to ask. The pirate experience represents an extreme case study in human adaptation that challenges our assumptions about the limits of acceptable behavior and the nature of civilization itself. Despite all our historical research and archaeological evidence, mysteries remain about the full extent of pirate practices. Some accounts describe practices so extreme that historians still debate their accuracy. The complete truth about life in these maritime communities may be too disturbing for civilized minds to fully comprehend. What we do know is disturbing enough. The 5 habits we've explored represent documented historical practices that real people embraced as solutions to extreme survival challenges. They remind us that human beings are capable of both remarkable adaptation and profound degradation, sometimes simultaneously. The legacy of these practices extends far beyond their historical period. They represent a testament to both human resilience and human fragility, our capacity to survive almost anything and our inability to survive it unchanged. The reality of pirate practices challenges traditional historical narratives that focus on political, economic, and military developments while ignoring the brutal human realities that made those developments possible. The pirates we've studied weren't just criminals, they were human beings, pushed to extremes that revealed both the best and worst of human nature. Their story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that civilization is an achievement that requires constant maintenance and can be lost more quickly than most people imagine. The practices we've explored represent one possible future for any society that loses its way. Understanding the reality of pirate practices doesn't just inform our view of the past, it challenges us to think about the present and future. What conditions might drive modern people to make similar choices? How can societies maintain civilized standards under extreme pressure? What can we learn from this historical example about the importance of maintaining human dignity even in desperate circumstances? These questions become more urgent as our world faces increasing challenges that could test the stability of civilized institutions. The pirate experience serves as both warning and preparation, showing us one possible path of human development that we must work to avoid. As you reflect on what we've explored together, remember that the capacity for both the degradation and the resilience we've witnessed remains part of human nature. The choice between civilization and barbarism is one that every generation must make anew, and the stakes of that choice are higher than most people imagine. The revolting truth about real pirates isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror that reflects both the darkest possibilities and the precious fragility of human civilization. What we choose to see in that mirror and what we do with that knowledge will determine whether we learn from this history or risk repeating it. What will you choose when faced with your own extreme circumstances? The pirates we've studied made their choices, and history has recorded the results. Now, the choice is yours. If you found this exploration of history's darkest maritime secrets as disturbing and fascinating as we did, there are more untold stories waiting to be discovered. What other historical truths might be hiding behind sanitized popular narratives? The search for uncomfortable historical realities continues, and every discovery changes how we understand both the past and ourselves.